Hi, Shalom Chaverim. Sadly, there are many ways to hurt a person. There's, of course, the physical harm you do to a person, and then there's financial harm you could do to a person. There's spiritual harm and emotional harm. What's interesting about harming a person is the person who was wounded can often point. It's almost obvious that something negative happened to them. So a kid that walks in with a black eye, or God forbid, a broken foot, and says so-and-so did it to me, it's very clear that this person is in need of help. If you're financially lost and the bank is taking your house and business, it's very clear you don't have the assets or the money to pay for it. But when we talk about emotional pain and emotional wounds, it's very difficult because no one can see it. Only you're suffering from it. But everyone, the person looks healthy. In fact, they're productive. I guess everything is fine in their world, when it's actually not. One of the most harmful and insidious forms of causing pain to a person is what we call verbal abuse. Now, I'm not going to talk about verbal abuse at this moment. It deserves a lecture in itself. I'm merely pointing this out because of the thought that I want to share with you. If verbal abuse is something that can cripple a child, and it's something that we very much have to be aware of, never to use it against children, against spouses, against students, we certainly shouldn't use it against ourselves. And here I'm referring to, at times, we verbally abuse ourselves. And we tell ourselves, we're worthless. We'll never amount to anything. We're failures. If someone were to tell you that, it would be very clearly identified as being obscene. How dare you say that? Who are you to say that? Especially when you're so totally wrong. And if you keep on saying it, that's verbal abuse, and you should be ashamed of yourself. But why do we tolerate it within ourselves? They tell of a boss who was a terrible human being, and in particular, he abused one of the employees. And whatever this employee did, the boss would say, terrible. You're worthless. I'm just keeping you on because I'm a kind person. And finally, this employee couldn't take it anymore. He says, boss, I had enough with you. Why do you keep saying that? Why do you keep saying that? The boss looks at him. I'm saying it. Everyone is saying it. He says, what do you mean everyone's saying it? Prove it to me that everyone is saying it. He says, I'll prove it to you. So he says, look, I got to go to City Hall to sign some papers. Come with me. They go down, and he hails a cab. They both come into the cab. And as the cab is pulling away, the employer says to the cabbie, he says, how much will it be until City Hall? He says, approximately $25. Okay. A minute later, he says to the cabbie, I have there's someone else in the cab. How much will it be now? He says, he doesn't count. It's the same $25. Now, whether or not this story happened, I do not know. But we could all wryly identify that this arrogant, maybe imaginary boss was so far off the mark. That didn't prove anything. So let's analyze this for a minute. What does it mean that I'm worthless? Well, let's contrast this with an ideal that many of us have. I'd like to be successful. Okay? How do you define success? Well, if it's financial success, that means he's able to do things without worrying about money. And we'll leave that open. How much money does a person need to feel comfortable? But Me, when I have to struggle to make ends meet, that means I'm not financially solvent. I'm not doing well. And if I'm not doing well, I consider myself a failure because of the struggles that I have to put bread on the table. Ask an academic, what's considered success? Well, classes are well attended, he's on the lecture circuit, he already put out 3 books, very successful. What about you? I'm telling you, I'm struggling to fill my classes. I'm a great teacher, so I thought it's an interesting topic, and people are not coming. I'm just struggling to continue. And I could give other examples. Maybe you feel you're inadequate as a parent. How do you know you're inadequate? You know, a good parent has children that somehow respect him and listen to him. Me, it's a struggle to get them to do homework. It's a struggle for me to get them to clean up their room. What they all have in common is the word struggle. Somehow in our mind, when you're struggling, that's a sign of your lack of success. And the more you struggle, the more intense the feeling of not being successful. What happens if I told you that this perspective is so totally wrong? It's the opposite. That success comes from the struggle. The more you struggle, the more successful you will be. In fact, the more successful you are, because the struggle gives birth to success. Let me bring to your attention a very famous biblical story. Yaakov, or in English, Jacob, he's on his way back to Israel, and a very mysterious thing happens. He's crossing a little river, and he stays alone, and then a man comes and wrestles with him an entire night. In the morning, this man, who turns out to be actually an angel, a spiritual force, says to Jacob, "Let me go." And Jacob says, "I want you to acknowledge me before I let you go. I want you to bless me." And he says, "Okay, this is the blessing. Your name is not Jacob, it's Israel." But of course, these are English, so let me tell you the Hebrew. Your name is not Yaakov, which means he who holds on to a heel. Your name is Yisrael, because Yisrael means you struggled against man. And you prevailed. Now, if you remember that story, you also remember that Jacob or Yaakov limped after that. Now, stop for a second and ask yourself the most obvious of questions. If the angel wants to compliment or acknowledge the superiority of Jacob or of Yaakov, why does he call him Yisrael, which means it's a description of the struggle? Why not just talk about the victory? So your name is Netzach, victory, or your name is Gibor, mighty, or something very, very creative. Why Yisrael? What are we called? The Jewish nation? We're the children from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And the Yaakov has 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. And yet, we don't call ourselves Bnei Yaakov, the children of Jacob. We're called Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. The name which denotes struggle. We are people who are the offspring of a person who struggled, and he struggled and prevailed. So next time you think to yourself, am I successful? Am I making progress? Think to yourself, am I struggling? Yes. Am I on the floor? No. Have I been affected by my struggle? Yes. I'm limping. But the fact that I struggled and refused to give up, on the contrary, I'm continuing even if I feel the effect of that struggle. My friends, you are a prince of God, which is another interpretation of the word Yisrael. Sar El, he who is a prince with the godly energy that's inside of him. And it's an amazing thing. We have one of the famous verses of scripture that the righteous man falls 7 times and gets up. Many interpret it very simply that the righteous man doesn't have an easy life, and he often confronts issues. Sometimes he makes mistakes, but each time he picks himself up and he continues. If you hear this carefully, his righteousness is based on the idea that though he falls, he gets up. He doesn't stay fallen, because that's not only a defeatist attitude, it's not a human attitude. A human will struggle, and a human will grow from that struggle. So let's end off with a positive. The positive is very simple. We truly become most human when we struggle against poverty, when we struggle to get rid of ignorance, when we struggle to get rid of meanness, cruelty, when we struggle to do what's right. And through this struggle, something beautiful is being created. The opportunity to touch the divine. Shalom.